Thank you, Paul. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the amazing work you've been doing with Cass over the last 2 or 3 years. Thank you to Anna Haug for all the administrative work that makes it possible for people like me to stand here as if by magic. The biggest question that I want to have organize my talk is, how do major media corporations use images of piracy as they work to shape the ways that we engage the world? We're soon going to have another chance to find out, because on May 20th, Walt Disney Company will be releasing On Stranger Tides, which is the 4th in its famous Pirates of the Caribbean series, following on from The Curse of the Black Pearl in 2003, Dead Man's Chest in 2006, and At World's End, which some of us thought might be the end, in 2007. Just before I go any further, how many of you have seen the first of those films, Curse of the Black Pearl? Oh, wow. Okay, that's a big help. How about the second one? Okay, how about the third, the real diehards? Well, actually, this is a pretty good cross-section of global responses. The first one was extremely popular, even more popular than Disney had anticipated. The second one, in fact, reaped the largest financial reward for them of the trio. It was so bad that by the third one, even though it promised to conclude the series, audiences fell away, and I can see that many of you did too. It's a labor of something, not necessarily love, to plow through all three. But let me just mention briefly my interest in these films and the reasons for it. It's really at the convergence of two projects, one quite specific and one more general. The specific one is I'm interested as a teacher of global histories about how we can use Hollywood film to more effectively engage students' interest in not only images of the past, but the ways those images of the past get used to promote particular ways of engaging the present. And films like this are a great way of meeting students where they are and then trying to take them into areas they've never been before. Specifically in that regard, as Paul mentioned, when I first came here, used Peter Linebaugh and Marcus Rediker's book, Many-Headed Hydra, which has as one of its central chapters a powerful description of the role of communal or democratic forms of rebel piracy around the Atlantic in the late 17th, early 18th century, a theme that Marcus elaborates on in more detail in his later book, Villains of All Nations. And so when I was teaching this, I had to say something about the pirate series, and I have done endlessly, even after I've stopped using this book. So that's part of my concern. But as Paul mentioned, I also have a broader set of concerns, and that is to ask how it is that dominant forms of cultural production, orchestrated mainly by major corporations and allied politicians, have been relating to the transformations in the workings of capitalism over the last 30 or 40 years as they've been played out within the boundaries of the United States. I'm particularly interested in the idea that capitalism always depends on particular ways of shaping people's attitudes and commitments, and that if it changes the ways it works, it renders its old methods anachronistic. The question is, how then, in varied forms, might capital be trying to reorganize the kinds of subjects that it produces? What I want to do in the context of both of those projects is ask 4 questions today. The first one is, what has the series brought us? The second one, what does it mean? And then to add 2 questions to the flyer, why should it matter? And finally, where can we go from here, especially as we turn from what we've seen so far to the new film that will come out on May 20th. The argument I want to make very broadly is that while these films are certainly entertaining, and I think especially for a target audience of teenagers and people in their 20s, they're not just escapist entertainment. They're also, and perhaps more significantly, they're a way of using images of 18th century rebel piracy to incite, or perhaps more accurately, excite, a conformity to particular corporate visions of how we relate to life, to labor, to leadership, and the world at large among the multiple challenges that the present offers us. My aims in making this argument are to offer resources for thoughtfully engaging the new film, for pushing against the limits of these corporate visions as they're promoted in the series, because I think some of those visions are seriously confining and restricting, not to say in some cases threatening, of the ways that we live and think about our daily lives. And more generally, to suggest some ways of thinking more creatively about the cultural politics of contemporary capitalism. Before proceeding, I just want to get a few points in quickly that I hope will help you as you engage what I go on to say. The first is that I'm interested in the films as a window into the visions that corporations are promoting and the stories that they use to do so. This is not about either the conscious intent of the film's authors or the film's actual effects. I think the question of effect is something that we can only work out through detailed ethnographic analysis. So I'm interested in these films and what they tell me about what corporations are telling us. And I don't think that when corporations spin their stories, they're necessarily doing so with some conspiratorial intent. Rather, they work within particular, partly taken for granted assumptions about how to engage audiences where they are with the problems that they face and the interests they have, and to suggest ways of addressing those interests and concerns in ways that are congruent with a taken for granted set of assumptions about how capitalism should work today. Secondly, I want to say that there is, of course, an element of playfulness in all of this. It is the end of term, after all, and pirates are fun. But I also think there are good reasons for taking a series like this seriously. First of all, I think we need to take very seriously the dominant forms of cultural influence that operate the world that we live in, and to recognize that those are sometimes at their most powerful when they come disguised in the form of entertainment, and especially escapist entertainment. Secondly, Disney is among the world's leading 5 global media conglomerates, and of course has been the most powerful media conglomerate for many years in trying to shape the attitudes of young children and their parents. And what these films represent is an attempt to move into a much larger audience of late teenagers and people in their 20s. So we need to take very seriously what it is that Disney is saying. This was its big rival to Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. And Disney, in fact, invested huge amounts of money in creating these stories and then making sure that they would be seen and heard. Moreover, what I want to say is that these films and the stories that they tell, while I think they're interesting in themselves, are mainly significant because of the ways that they resonate with stories and images being told elsewhere and offered elsewhere. That if the stories themselves were out there on an island, unrelated to what was being said in other contexts, then I think they would have much less power. What really renders them powerful is the ways that they echo and refortify stories that are being told in other forms, such as in major magazines and in the management literature that has been generated since the late 70s to try and suggest how companies should reorganize themselves, but also reshape the attitudes of their workers in the context of major changes. The third thing I want to say is that I've deliberately couched this talk in a way that I hope can reach the widest possible audience. So I have backgrounded a number of theoretical and conceptual issues that I would be happy to discuss at the end of the talk and afterwards. But also, I wanted to do it in such a way as to convey not only some resources we can use to make sense of these movies, but also where I think the fun can lie, not just in watching these movies uncritically, but the new and different kind of pleasure that you can watch as you begin to see what's going on in the midst of the entertainment. I remember in my early 20s, as I began to learn how to reread the things I was watching through a more critical eye, how much fun it was to both enjoy the movie and to think critically about what it was saying and its relation to what was going on in the wider world. Final thing I want to say by way of introduction is that this is very much an abbreviated, perhaps one should say a skeletal version of a much longer argument. And I'd be happy to flesh out parts of what I say in discussion, including particularly as regards the theoretical and conceptual issues that are woven through but lie beneath the surface of what I'm saying. Finally, of course, it's very much a work in progress. It's very much open to your input and feedback, and I'd be grateful for any thoughts that you have. So, with all of that said, what have the series brought us so far? What I want to suggest is that they have brought us three interwoven narratives. The first narrative is about personal relations. It's about the relations between Elizabeth Swann and Will Turner. Elizabeth, the daughter of the governor of Jamaica, attracted to Will, but Will is a working class artisan. And the problem of their attraction is that Will doesn't seem to have the kind of daring necessary to break through class barriers to woo Elizabeth. And in that context, Elizabeth becomes attracted in some way to Jack Sparrow, Captain Jack Sparrow, the pirate. And so a triangular relationship emerges between the three of them, in which Will then also has to work out his relationship to Jack's piracy, and then the knowledge that his father was in fact a pirate. So that's the first kind of triangle. The second set of relationships involved is between the pirates as a whole and the British elites as they govern the Atlantic. In the first film, as you know, Governor Swan and Norrington. By the second and the third, added and then ultimately displaced by Cutler Beckett, the head of something called the East India Trading Company, very thinly veiled version of the East India Company, of course. And the question, the fundamental question in some ways through the films from the point of view of the pirates, is who is going to control the seas, or how at least can they overthrow the control that oppressive British elites are exercising over them. That comes to implicate Elizabeth and Will, as you know, in all kinds of ways. But there's a fourth element in these films, and that is the relationship of all of these people to characters called Tia Dalma, who we later know as Calypso, and to Davy Jones. And although they are particular characters, they also quite explicitly are said to stand for the seas, for the different forces that operate in the sea. So there's a kind of ecological thread going through this as well, about how human beings relate to nature in both its destructive forms associated with Davy Jones and its potentially more liberating forms as associated with Calypso. Now, what I want to suggest is that the sometimes dizzying storylines as they unfold through the three films are in fact anchored by the continuous repetition of this structure. That these positions remain constant throughout the three films. Moreover, they're anchored by an emphasis on particular kinds of groupings and particular kinds of themes. This is just from Curse of the Black Pearl, the very first of the films, but what it suggests is it isn't just a relationship between particular people, it's a relationship between categories of people, between British elites and pirates, but also in class terms between elites and intermediaries and subordinates, Elizabeth subordinated by her gender, Will by class, and that what is at issue here is partly the theme of love and hate, trust and deceit, but also, especially in the struggle of the pirates, to gain control, or at least freedom of the seas, the stress, the tension between life as represented and freedom as represented for Jack by the Black Pearl, and constraint and death represented by the curse in the first film of the Aztec gold. Now, these films, I think, through this structure, tell stories that are explicitly pedagogical. They set up dilemmas for their central characters at the beginning. They then complicate the situation further and then offer partial resolutions. Those partial resolutions then set up new dilemmas, new contradictions, and new resolutions, and repeat as needed. I mean, that's the great thing about a franchise like this. This formula, based on those kinds of structures, can go on forever. But within that framework, the pedagogies, I think, are very important. What they suggest to us is not only what we should aspire to, through seeing what it is that the heroes aspire to, but also how it is we should get there. We see the main characters learning better how to get what it is they want from those. We see those around them learning from what the central characters do, and as audiences we are asked to learn from the learning that is going on. And more specifically, what's emphasized, at least what I want to tease out for our present purposes, are four kinds of action that are meant to help move us towards a resolution of the dilemmas and the complications, do that for the characters and offer us lessons in the process. It tells us what's valued by both heroizing particular kinds of action and establishing contrastive forms of demonization in relation to people who are held to be either impeding these activities or doing them, quote, the wrong way. The first category I want to look at is what the films have to say about life in general. And in particular, the idea that to live properly in a world like this, you need to be skilled at making deals. But making deals isn't just about bargaining for your own immediate advantage. What we learn through the film is that those who just do that get into trouble. That what you need to do as you make deals is also know with whom it's appropriate to build trust and with whom it isn't. So just very briefly, at the very beginnings of the film, Jack arrives, as you know, in the port. The first thing he does, of course, is strike a bargain with the harbor master, bribing him 3 shillings to be able to dock. He then, of course, then steals the money for him. That's a relatively contracted version of a deal. It's unlike most of the others because most of the others involve a deferral, the promise of something down the road in return for an advantage in the present. Elizabeth, we see, when she is taken on board Barbossa's ship, tries to make a deal, realizing she has something of value, the medallion, the Aztec coin, that he wants. But it turns out she's not very good at making a deal, and instead of letting her free, he takes her with him. Will then turns up once he realizes she's been taken and comes to Jack in jail, a man who represents a kind of piracy that Will hates, but decides that he has to make a deal with Jack because the authorities are not willing to make deals in order to go and rescue Elizabeth. And the deal is, of course, that in rescuing Elizabeth, Jack will be able to get back the black pearl that has been stolen from him. So the idea of deal-making and forging trust is absolutely at the center here, and it's contrasted all the way through with the rigidity and hierarchical forms of the British rule as represented by Swan and by Norrington, and then of the complete unwillingness to be flexible and to trade back and forth shown by Cutler Beckett. So both positively and negatively here we've got a valorization of a crucial skill, the skill of being able to make deals, and to understand a particular kind of what I want to call a grammar of action, in which it's not just that you blindly trust anyone else, but you work out a kind of selective ethic in which you know who it is you can trust and who it is you can't trust. It is, by the end of the series, okay to cheat the people who are bad, but important to trust and make lasting compacts with the people who the film represents as good. The second kind of action I want to highlight is around labor. The argument here is that as Jack and Will set out to find Elizabeth and the Black Pearl, and repeatedly throughout the series, people try and get what they want, not only by making deals, but especially in forms of Will and Jack and later Elizabeth, by either forming or joining crews and setting out to work hard to get what they want in the face of constant challenges and pressing deadlines. These crews are characterized in a quite specific way as flattened hierarchies. Jack as the captain, Gibbs as the first mate, and then people like Marty, Cotton, and in the first film Anna Maria as crew members, a certain level of hierarchy, but real informality compared to the other crews, the Royal Navy crews, the crews of Hector Barbossa on the Black Pearl in the first film, the crews of Davy Jones in the second and third film are, by contrast, once again, extremely hierarchical, rigid, top-down, control not through inspiration or charisma, but through oppressive violence from the top. Thirdly, leadership. Although the films suggest that you get things done by making deals and forming teams to go off and work together intensely to get things that you need, led by visionary leaders, leadership is not suppressed in the ways that we know from the work of people like Marcus Rediker. It was true of communal and democratic piracy in the late 17th, early 18th century. Those kinds of piracy were explicitly committed to the notion of communal ownership and control of the ship and whatever it gained. Pirate captains were elected and led at the will of the members of the crew. These films retain a notion that captaincy and more generally leadership is important. What they emphasize is that that kind of leadership must be not simply from people who have inherited a position or qualified it through official channels, but instead have gained the right to lead by appearing as natural leaders through their vision or charisma. And once again, the contrast is really explicit. Hector Barbosa has gained captaincy of the Black Pearl by stealing it through a mutiny. Davy Jones has, in fact, obtained the Flying Dutchman by betraying Calypso. In Cutler Beckett's case, he simply rules by brute force and pure economic calculation. Repeatedly, he says that what he's doing is just good business. And I think this is actually very important because we've heard very often that in this day and age, what capital encourages us to do, to be what is often called neoliberal subjects, people guided by an economizing logic of calculative rationality in pursuit of our own personal interests, not only in the world of work or the economic sphere, but across all spheres of activity. These films quite explicitly represent that as part of the problem and suggest a different way of interacting with people if you want to get things done. The fourth kind of action that I want to talk about has to do with what the ultimate goals of all of this might be. This is not a story about how to fit in with a world that already exists. These are stories about the capacity of world making. And what's stressed, particularly in the second and the third films, is that people are struggling to free the seas and in the process free themselves by undoing the control, first of all, of the moderately benign but nonetheless rigid and hierarchical British authorities represented by Swan and Norrington, and then later to free themselves from the brutal tyranny of people like Cutler Beckett and the company that he represents. So time and again, what we hear is that the search for freedom isn't just a personal search for freedom through something like the Black Pearl or the freedom to woo and marry whoever you want within society, but a larger social freedom that liberates the sea from authoritarian rule and that also opens up ecologically the productive part of the sea represented by Calypso by killing off the threats that are represented by Davy Jones. Now, in that context, I think it might be helpful just to look briefly at the way that the first film concludes. By pursuing all of these kinds of actions against people who are acting very differently, at least a partial resolution is achieved. Hector Barbosa is killed. Elizabeth and Will, big surprise, get to unite and are about to be married. Jack, meanwhile, gets to escape, gets back onto the Black Pearl, looks at his compass and works out where it is that they will be going next. So what we are asked to think by the end of the first film is that faced with particular dilemmas and constraints, people pursuing good forms of deal making, the right kinds of intense labor with a crew, under the right kinds of leadership, will be able to free, or at least open up some space of freedom within the existing system. By the end of the first film, it's a compromise. In fact, what we hear from Weatherby Swan when Jack has escaped is this. He turns to Norrington and he says about whether they should pursue Jack right away. Perhaps on the rare occasion, pursuing the right course demands an act of piracy. Piracy can itself be the right course. And I think what's being said here is not that the sea should be surrendered to piracy, but that British rulers have to learn that if they want the world to be a better place, some kind of synthesis has to be achieved between the various kinds of respectability represented by Will and Elizabeth and a kind of spirit of piracy, not as theft, but as daring and a willingness to bend and break the rules represented by Jack. Once we get to the end of the third film, the resolution has a little more complicated. What in fact has happened by the end, and I'm sorry if this is a spoiler for any of you who are waiting with bated breath to know what happens, the entire upper hierarchy has been killed off one way or another. Davy Jones has been killed off. The evil pirate Xiao Feng is dead. Barbossa has converted, at least partially, to better forms of piracy. And so the world is left in the hands of Elizabeth and Will, Jack and Barbossa, and Tia Dalma as Calypso, now released. And very simply, Calypso is released. Will has taken on the captaincy of the Flying Dutchman, the ship that was initially charged with taking the souls of people who died at sea into their final resting place, a job that Davy Jones had abandoned, and Will now takes over. What that means is he has to be at sea for 10 years at a time and can only come on shore once every 10 years. So in fact, even though he and Elizabeth are now united, they can only see each other once every 10 years. He has to go off to work constantly, leaving her at home. Moreover, in Disney's notion of sexual procreation, Will kisses Elizabeth on the knee, and that leads to her getting pregnant. And so 9 months later, she bears a son, but Will not get to see her until 10 years later, while Elizabeth and the son patiently wait for him to appear on the horizon. Meanwhile, Jack and Barbossa seem to be free to escape in the Black Pearl, but Barbossa, reverting to his old character, steals the map that will lead to the Fountain of Youth, a central theme in the fourth film, and thinks that he is going to be able to escape on the Black Pearl with the Black Pearl's crew and leave Jack behind. But then we learn right at the end that Jack has in fact taken out the very center of the map and can set off just as he entered on his own small dinghy in the free seas to try and find the Fountain of Youth. Okay. What does all of this mean? Well, I'll be able to tell you better if I get my notes in order. What it all means is something that I think obviously is open to interpretation. But what struck me when I first watched these films was how much of what they were talking about echoed language that was being valorized, or images that were being valorized about what it meant to be an effective person in the world today in various kinds of management literature. I was reading something that also came out in 2003, which was Andrew Ross's book, No Collar, based on ethnographic research he did with people in new economy workplaces in New York. I was reading Stephen Klein et al.'s book called Digital Play, about the video game industry and the lives of people who work making video games. I mean, actually designing them, not the people who labored to produce the material content. And I was also later led to Boltanski and Chiapello's book, which also came out in English translation in 2003, called The New Spirit of Capitalism, which includes a very extensive review of what the management literatures of the time were saying about how managers themselves should change to catch up with new conditions, and how it was that they should get their workers to change. And what struck me as I saw the film in conjunction with reading these texts was that how much of what the film values under the image of rebel piracy, with all its historical associations with communalism and democracy, was in fact a kind of conformity to the imperatives of the new kind of corporate capitalist discourse as expressed through things like the management literature. To get at that, I think we first need to unpack a number of obvious contradictions, or at least apparent contradictions, in the workings of these films. First of all, of course, Disney has made its name as a provider of wholesome family entertainment, and yet this is a film whose central character is modeled on Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones, is socially dissolute, sexually ambiguous, and so on and so forth. So what is Disney doing with this kind of a character as its one of its central figures? Secondly, of course, Disney is a major global corporation working very hard, especially in the 1990s and 2000s, to extend itself globally by whatever means possible. And yet the most demonized entity in the whole series is the East India Trading Company under Cutler Beckett, who is exactly trying to extend the global reach of the East India Trading Company by whatever means it can. And thirdly, of course, Disney's films valorize a certain kind of piracy. And yet, Disney is notorious for most aggressively asserting its intellectual property claims and prosecuting those who seem to infringe on this. A contradiction or apparent contradiction captured by for anyone who watches the videos, because the first thing you see is, of course, is the FBI anti-piracy warning that precedes the titles and then the introduction of these heroic pirate figures. Now, all of these will seem like significant contradictions, but what I want to suggest is that, in fact, those contradictions are illusory. First of all, and I'm going to pause just a moment. I wish this were rum, but but it's not. First thing to say is, as regards the first of those contradictions, Disney, first of all, in some very interesting ways, has never been pro-family values. And anyone who looks at the way it represents motherhood, or more accurately, the complete erasure of motherhood from its content, will understand the complexity of its relationship to a pedagogy about family values. But also, of course, by trying to reach this teenage and early 20s audience, expand its reach beyond children and their parents, young children and their parents, it was quite deliberately taking on a more risque association with fading rock stars and a sort of bohemian, artistic, and artisanal way of life. Secondly, what I think is going on around the demonization of a big company trying to be global is a kind of self-immunization. What Disney, I think, is saying through a film like this is, well, there are ways that you can try and be global that we should not approve of. But by implication, if Disney is able to produce a critique of this, it can't be that kind of company. And thirdly, as regards piracy, Disney remains largely aggressive in its assertion of intellectual property rights, but like a lot of firms, especially around video games, has come to learn how it can actually appropriate the labor of people who pirate its goods through checking in on how it is that, having taken their video games, they've reworked them. People constituted in the language of Klein and others when they talk about digital play as prosumers. That is, people who are consumers of the goods, even if they're pirated, but also producers of ways of making those games better, that the big companies then essentially utilize labor that people provide freely, that the companies can then utilize to make their games better. So Disney, in fact, hasn't been as aggressively anti-piratical in all the areas as you might think. But more crucially, of course, what it's doing is it's shifting the goalposts. It's defining piracy for its purposes in these films, not as robbery or theft, but as daring, rebellion, the willingness to bend or break the rules in the pursuit of a higher good. And so what I think we see in these films is the attempt to hijack a particular set of images of rebel piracy and, in fact, use them to induce conformity to particular corporate visions about how people should fit within the demands of a new world in the making. That new world is one that created enormous stresses for people during the 1980s and the 1990s. These films were being, well, the first one was being made in the early 2000s. What was the world in the United States like for most people by that point? Well, first of all, enormous material stresses on people. Between 1973 and 2000, the bottom 90% of households saw their real income decline by 7%, while the top 0.01% saw their incomes rise by 600%. Moreover, the ways people responded to that declining household income was to increase the amount that they worked, as indicated here. In the space between the 1970s and the 2000s, the average US household increased its total labor by at least a month. And this is a context in which, of course, some people are taking on huge amounts of labor. Other people are desperate for more work but can't get enough of it. 40% of people in the growing number of part-time jobs actually need full-time jobs but can't get them. But the total number of hours goes up. Social benefits of various kinds, either provided by the state or by employers, are being cut back massively. This graph charts the growth in the number of people who are uninsured. In this context, people have to spend more and more of their money buying resources that might have previously been available to them as entitlements. To do that, they take on more and more debt, both consumer credit card debt and mortgage debt. So what we have here is Disney putting together a film in a context of a restructuring process that's been unfolding since the 1970s with the promise that it would increase prosperity. Addressing an audience, at least in the United States, but in fact in many ways globally as well, that is suffering increasing stresses partly around the question of labor and how, not only how you should act in the workplace, but how you should deal with demands to work harder and harder without significant increases in pay, but also a situation in which people increasingly were told that you cannot rely for what you need on either the state or your employer when things get tough. You have to rely on privatized and personalized forms of networking. And that, I think, is a key to understanding what it is that the films valorize and heroize for us. To take what I talked about initially as life, labor, leadership, and the world at large, what we see is that in fact the films, as an intervention in a context of increasing stress about how to live one's daily life, and more generally, of course, a crisis of legitimacy for the wider restructuring project, suggest to us that through making deals in a trusting way, one is in fact doing exactly what the management literature says we should learn to do, which is to become flexible networkers, people who can continuously reconstruct our relationship with others, while at the same time, what the film does time and again is it takes this kind of imagery and reinforces it. Corporate discourses played out through management literature, but also tries to re-fortify it. So it says, yes, flexible networking, but not as a cynical manipulator of other people, but instead as Jack learns to become, and Elizabeth and Will are, as ethical networkers who know who to build the relationships with and how to do it properly. Secondly, as regards labor, the pursuit of rebel piracy by forming crews and flattened hierarchies and going off and working intensely to get one's goal is, of course, a direct echo of the logics demanded of workers in the new workplace. The logics of project-oriented labor by rapidly assembled teams working under extremely intense deadlines where they work as long as possible and as hard as possible in order to get the job done by the deadline, in which the boundaries between home and work collapse in the favor of work. All of this is in fact what the pirate crews under someone like Jack are doing. And it's contrasted with the soulless, living dead labor of working in the crews of Davy Jones and Hector Barbosa. But what's added here is the idea that this kind of labor, instead of being exhausting and enervating, should be seen as exciting, exhilarating, and ultimately in the social good. Moreover, what we see echoed through the idea of a certain kind of captaincy, a sort of charismatic captaincy, is exactly, again, what you see in the management literature that says the old top-down forms of management control should be abandoned in favor of flattened hierarchies and charismatic leadership. But what these films do is they say yes, but only if that kind of leadership can be earned by the right kind of people. If it can be earned, then people should follow. And finally, we get this notion of the free seas, very much echoing the notion that the world we live in today is a fluid and mobile world a space, as Manuel Castells called it, a space of flows. And in fact, time and again, the metaphors used to describe the contemporary world as it has been created are liquid metaphors. So taking a story to sea and asking it how to live on the seas becomes a crucial part of a broader story. What's suggested here is that what people are doing is not simply adapting to a new world, but making that freedom through the ways in which they live, labor, and accept particular kinds of leadership. And that's contrasted to more oppressive ways of running a global world as represented first by Weatherby Swan and Jack Norrington, and then more vividly and more threateningly by Cutler Beckett and the East India Trading Company. Why does all of this matter? Well, I think you've gathered from what I've said already that I think these films are very much about inciting, or I might say through the action-adventure mode, exciting a kind of conformity to a particular set of demands about how we retool not only our actions, but our ambitions and our understandings of the labor that we do for our employers, but also in our wider lives, in ways that in fact are quite threatening. But before I get there, let me just talk a little bit about the ways in which these films seem to suggest a sort of heroic role for all their major characters, but in fact are highly selective in doing so. And in so doing, actually employ a number of powerful silences and erasures that undermine the rights of everyone involved to feel like they are equally capable of participating in this system. Put broadly, what we see is exciting conformity through privatized, individuated, transient connections. Excuse me just a second, will you? Okay. Well, okay. Let me just go back to this quickly. I did a last-minute switch in the slides. The reason that I have those three images up there is this. First of all, on racial issues. The film is really striking in the fact that although it's set in the Caribbean in the early 18th century and it's about control of the seas, it doesn't mention why the British might want to control the seas. That is, of course, that they were becoming the dominant power, or were to become soon the dominant power in the control of the slave trade. Moreover, in portraying Governor Swan as the basically honorable governor of Jamaica, they were neglecting the fact that Jamaica had, from the late 17th century, been the leading destination for British slaves, or slaves that the British obtained in order to work on sugar plantations. That the wealth and prosperity of the Swans and the wealth and prosperity that Will marry into is based on slave labor. Moreover, and perhaps more crucially, in a way that is repeatedly true of Disney films, there is a complete erasure, not just in this case of slavery and the slave trade, but of production in general. These are films about the world of circulation. They never ask how it is that things get produced under what conditions. There's a similar erasure that I've already alluded to as regards gender. In these films, the most striking thing is that until the very end, and in fact after the final credits have run on at World's End, there is no representation of a single living mother, nor in fact of a single living wife. And in fact, Elizabeth's fate, however much she's been heroized in the movie as someone who can take on the world of men and act creatively in it, is eventually her reward is to stay at home looking after the kid while her husband is away 10 years at a time getting on with the job, and moreover doing so in a way that is designed to help save his father. So restoration of a particular kind of patriarchal male line that leaves the woman staying at home looking after the kid. But more generally, and what's more important, is that this is the only time we actually see a mother in the whole film at all. And a second erasure is involved here, just like the omission of slavery is not only racist, it's also an erasure of production. So it is here that we've an erasure of reproductive labor. Once again, we're never afforded an understanding of the material labors that go into making possible the privilege that is enjoyed not only by the Swans, but by people like Will. And then finally, the working classes eventually become pirates. In that sense, they're freed from the constraints of other more hierarchical forms of labor. But they're always represented as people who must be led, who could never aspire to be anything other than the kinds of workers that they already are. All they can aspire to is a better leader. One way of looking at all of this then will be to say that it's about prejudicial exclusion from a prize worth having. What I want to suggest, to go back to the slide I'd begun to talk to you, is that in fact what's really problematical is that the prize that others win may itself be a problematical thing to aim for. That what we're asked to think about when we look at flexible and ethical networking is, yes, a reliance on the ability to build relationships of trust with other people to get things done, but very much in the notion that we can aspire to nothing more, that we cannot aspire to having a social system that ensures through the state or through employers that everyone is taken care of. It's now a matter of individuals working it out for themselves. In the case of labor, that yes, we're going to have to keep working, and yes, it may be exciting, but we are going to have to deal with the fact that it's going to be incredibly long hours, exhausting conditions, finite jobs, the end of a secure career, the growing emphasis on sequential jobs with often limited rewards. One of the things that Ross and Klein both talk about is when they looked at the new economy workplaces, a lot of people were given stock options and thought how great that was. Something like the apparent sharing in communal piracy of the distribution of what was gained in the end. Those stock options almost invariably turned out to be worthless because the companies went under. Moreover, the wages of people working in those companies was significantly less than the labor that was enjoyed by people in more stable, hierarchically organized institutions. And so what they were doing was they were accepting the promise of excitement in return for a significantly lower wage with infinitely extensible, almost infinitely extensible working days. In terms of leadership, what was also found in these companies was people thought that they were exciting because the hierarchies had been flattened. And because if leaders emerged at all, they emerged because of their vision and inspiration and transiently. But what they found was that when push came to shove with the dot-com crisis, that leadership reasserted itself. And that the inequalities that they thought had been erased from the workplace were viciously reasserted when it came to working out who should be kept and who should be fired. And more generally, in terms of the world at large, what I want to suggest is that the film, in suggesting a goal of freeing the small entrepreneur, if you like, the small pirate, from the constraints of those above, is in fact taking one part of a dialectical movement in capital over the last 30 years, which is on the one hand to fragment production through outsourcing both to factories and to consultants and service providers, but to do so at the same time by massively concentrating power in the hands of a small number of corporations. What the film does is flatten out that double movement into a single movement in which the world that these kinds of activities will produce is representing as producing freedom for lots of small operators. So finally then, where can we go from here? I've subtitled this Rival Piracy and Constructive Critique. Very quickly, what I want to suggest is that first of all, we can think about ways of understanding the cultural politics of capitalism today that go beyond a concentration that we've seen in a lot of work that says that the only real problem is a problem of overall legitimacy or consent, and that we need to focus on how it is that capitalists are trying to get most people to go along with the system as a whole. To me, that's only one part of the story. It's certainly in there. But we need to ask how it is that cultural work encourages support for particular versions of a project. That what Disney's promoting, in a way, is opposed to what certain other kinds of major corporations are promoting, or at least seems to be. But it's still trying to gain support for a particular vision of what will continue to make capitalist labor seem emancipating. But just as crucially is what I would call here shaping our attitudes about the conduct of our daily lives. Now, quite a lot of people have thought about this, but they've mainly thought about it under two headings. Either the image of the consumer citizen. So the function is how more and more of us are encouraged to think of ourselves as consumers in relation to markets rather than citizens in relation to the state. There's certainly a lot of that going on. But it's not enough just to focus on the refashioning of people as consumer subjects. Another way that, because what I want to suggest is a lot of work is going on to reshape our ideas about work, about personal relationships, and about political action. In fact, the four are almost invariably inseparable. Incitements to work in different ways are attached to incitements to be able to consume in new ways and to support particular kinds of political project, often all related back to what it means to be a good husband, a good wife, a good father, a good mother, and so on and so forth. So we need to look at the shaping of attitudes across all of those areas. Another kind of approach I'd want to ask us to push beyond is the notion that there is a promotion of a single kind of subject appropriate to all of those kinds of activities. We've seen this in the language from people taking out Foucault's work on neoliberal governmentality around the notion of the neoliberal subject, suggesting that what capital encourages is a subject who will calculate meticulously his or her economic advantage, not only in the workplace, but at home as regards the family, in consumption and everything else. But what I think I find when I look at lots of movies from the last 15 years or so is in fact that most of them constitute that way of being human as in fact dehumanizing, and seem therefore to address the concerns of many people that it's dehumanizing, but do so in such a way that they nonetheless excite conformities to other forms of a narrow vision of what it is to live, and at the same time do so not around the notion of a single right way of doing things, but in differential ways, ways that are class differential, race differential, and gender differential. Finally, what's the next film going to look like? What would happen if we were to bring these ways of thinking to a critical engagement with the next film? Well, I can't be sure about what the film's going to look like, but I've read as much as I can get my hands on. And what seems to be the case is that the structure is going to remain very much the same. This is the structure I showed you before. What it looks like we're getting now is Jack is still there, Barbossa's still there, but he's now working for George II. Will and Elizabeth have disappeared. Angelica is there. She, it turns out, is the daughter of Blackbeard. I've put a question mark down there because it's not sure whether he's going to represent piracy struggling against an alliance between the crown and an ex-pirate, or whether in fact he's up there in the realm of magic, but we certainly know there are going to be mermaids and zombies. I don't know whether this is Philip, a missionary, is going to turn out to be a love interest of Angelica's. We do know that Jack and Angelica were previously involved. What they're now trying to get their hands on is the Fountain of Youth, the thing that Jack was searching for at the end of the third series. What I do know, whether this kind of structure is repeated or not, is that we need to ask ourselves as we watch these films, however entertaining we may find them, as we watch the new film in particular, what's going on while we're being entertained? What kinds of subjects are we being asked to value? What kinds of work and labor, living and leadership are we being asked to support? And what does that mean in relation to the world as we actually live it? What I want to suggest is that we need to approach these films with a third definition of what rebel piracy might be involved. Not theft, not bending and breaking the rules in the service, in fact, of a reconfigured form of capital, but as people always willing to critically ask questions about and challenge the assumption that we should live with the world as it's given to us. That's it. Thank you very much.